Hello and good evening, and welcome to this People's Church special on Sunday evening. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Jonathan, I'm the minister from the church, and shortly we are going to be going over to Chesterfield to hear from Andy Kind, preacher and comedian, and he's got some good news for us, so we're looking forward to that. Andy is sharing with us the online version of his tour, Hidden in Plain Sight. So, without any further ado from me, get your hot chocolate in, get the snacks at the ready, and let's go over to Andy for some good news.
Hello, my name is Andy Kind, and today I've got some good news for you, which is this. The phrase, all things in moderation, was invented before the invention of Jaffa cakes. So I think we're fine. It doesn't apply. It doesn't apply to the consumption of Jaffa cakes. Eat as many as you like. I know I do. During the initial pandemic lockdown, I've consumed so many calories. Well, I'm basically just waiting for a small team of Oompa Loompas to turn up and start singing a creepy song about me. Now look, if you've never had the Christian gospel preached at you, I want you to know that gospel just means good news. But it's good news and not good advice. You know, it's good advice not to eat 93 Jaffa cakes over the course of 4 days and make yourself really ill. But that's never once stopped me. But I don't want anyone watching to think that I consider myself in some way superior. Just to give you an idea of the sort of bloke you're dealing with, you are looking at a man who, as a grown adult, on more than one occasion, has been to IKEA, hidden in the wardrobes, and upon being discovered, asked people directions to Narnia. That's this guy. So you can just relax. Now look, it doesn't mean I don't think I'm impressive. I probably am quite impressive. For instance, my refrigerator contains every sort of sauce and relish known to the Western Hemisphere, including varieties of relish no longer available on either the open or black markets. So that's the sort of man that you're dealing with. Really, my fridge is just a food bank for people who only eat condiments. Now this morning, the talk is called Hidden in Plain Sight. Are you ready? Let's begin. Now, I'm 35 years old and have been for a few years now, but when I was 22, something happened to me that I didn't really expect or particularly want to happen, which is that I became a Christian. I made the decision to start following Jesus. And at the age of 22, when that happened, part of me was distraught. I was devastated because I think I wanted something else to be true. I think I wanted another story to be true. You know, I was young, fresh out of university, single, relatively non-monstrous when it came to looks. And so for me, if Bacchus, the Roman god of wine, had turned out to be true, that would have suited me very nicely indeed. However, I came to the conclusion that Christianity was true. And I still find it tough because being a Christian in the 21st century, in the Western world, is tough. You know, if worldviews were items of clothing, Christianity is like turning up at a wedding in a tracksuit. We are the unauthorized objects in the bagging area for a lot of people in our society. So it's hard. You know, a lot of people will say to me, a lot of my friends who are not Christians, whether they call themselves spiritual or of other religions or atheists, they will say to me, Andy, we like you and we like the weird mountainside picture that you've got in the background, but Christianity is ridiculous. And you know, when someone says to me that the thing I believe most in the world is ridiculous, when someone says to me that the thing I've given my entire life over to is ridiculous, I have to say, I agree. Of course I agree. Of course I think it's ridiculous. I mean, I don't know if you've thought about it, those of us who would consider ourselves Christians, but the idea that God himself took on human form, came into our midst to find us, lived the perfect life, allowed himself to be killed, and then 3 days later rose from the dead, overturning death so that somehow you and I could have our relationship with God restored to its original factory setting. Well, that's not just ridiculous, that's absolutely binky bonkers. I mean, that's Arkham Asylum insane. Now, don't get me wrong, as I've said, my entire life is dedicated to persuading as many people as possible that that is our origin story, that is the big story that the universe is telling. But it doesn't mean I don't think it's at least a bit odd. However, a couple of things to say in response before the Christians start worrying who it is that's preaching here. First of all, for something to be true, I don't have to understand it. For something to be true, I don't have to be able to get my head around it. Lots of things are true whilst also seeming ridiculous to me. For instance, if someone had said to me on New Year's Day 2020, oh, by the way, by early May, most of your shoes will think you've been murdered and you will have forgotten where your trousers are. I mean, that would have seemed ridiculous, but true nevertheless. When I call something ridiculous or stupid or gorgeous, I'm saying at least as much about me and my perception as I am about the thing I'm talking about. If I am saying, if any of us are saying that something is only true once we understand it, if something can only be true if we don't find it ridiculous, then what we're saying is essentially we're God. I'm God. I must be, because nothing can happen outside of my purview, outside of my understanding. Fortunately, I mean, the good news, apart from the Jaffa Cakes, is that I am not God. You would know if I were God, because all socks would be remote controlled, and anybody who put on social media that they'd just done a cheeky 5K would be put in prison, or a cheeky prison, as I would call it. So that's the first thing to say. The second thing to say is, although I might concede that Christianity at least seems superficially on the surface ridiculous, well, so does every other single worldview out there. Whichever worldview you look at, and when I say worldview, I don't just mean religion, I mean way of seeing the world, the explanation that each of us give to how the world works and why. That's a worldview. Every worldview is ridiculous. No matter which worldview you choose, at some point you will reach a stage where it stops making sense to you, where you can no longer comprehend it, where you find it very difficult to process the truth of it. For instance, let's take as an example the creation of the universe. Every major worldview needs at some point to engage with and intersect with the creation of the universe. Now, we've known since the 1960s, because of Big Bang cosmology, that the universe hasn't always been there. The universe began to exist and it had a beginning. Now, as a result of that, the science will tell us that there are only two options for how that came into being. And you might not like one of the options, but it's okay, you've got a second option. So option one for how everything we see came into existence is that it was created by something or someone outside of itself. Something or someone who would have to be massively powerful, timeless, immaterial, as in not having a human body. Something or someone we might call God, small g, if you like. Now, some of you won't like that option. So as I've said, don't worry, you've got option two. This is your only other option, which is this. The universe created itself out of nothing. Now, we know from The Sound of Music that nothing comes from nothing, nothing ever could. Julie Andrews taught us that, and she's practically perfect in every way. But honestly, those are the two options for how we got here. Either the universe was created by a God, or out of nothing, nothing created everything for no purpose. Both of those stories are ridiculous. One of them's true. Whether you like it or not, one of those gives a true account of how we got here. And you get to decide which of those you think, on balance, makes the most sense. Christians believe in the virgin birth of Jesus. Atheists believe in the virgin birth of the universe. Pick a miracle. Choose your weapon, young knight. The fact that nothing in creation could ever have created creation should be our first signpost towards working out what is true. But if we can at least concede that everything seems ridiculous, that whichever worldview you choose, it's quite difficult to make it cohere and stick together in the way that you'd like it to. If we can at least call it nil-nil, then we are still left with the really interesting proposition that something about the universe is true. There is a true story that the universe is telling. You know, your life is happening. Your life is a true story. It might not be a very good one, but at the age of 22, I realized that my life was being written, and I wanted to know who was writing this stuff. So at the age of 22, I went searching for meaning, as we all do at some point in our lives. At some point, we all want to have answers to the big three questions surrounding origin, purpose, and destiny. These are very much the chocolate, vanilla, and strawberry of metaphysical questions. So origin, where did I come from, or where did it all come from? Purpose, why am I here? Destiny, where am I going? I wanted to have answers to these questions. It wasn't that at university I wasn't asking questions, but they just maybe weren't as profound. At uni, I was asking questions like, what flavour pot noodle shall I have for my tea tonight? Who's my favourite member of S Club 7? No brainer. And should I wash my sheets this week or just Febreze them again? So I started asking bigger questions, and I didn't know at that point what I believed about the big story that the universe is telling. And when I say big story, I simply mean whatever is ultimately true about the universe, about what's out there. I didn't know what was out there, but I knew what was in here. I knew that I had a little story, things that were definitely true for me and about me, regardless of what anybody else believed. They were things like this. I believed in love, not just love, but unconditional love. I didn't want to be rejected because of who I was or what I did. I believed in objective morality. That's to say, I believed that some things were objectively, bindingly wrong, regardless of what anybody else thought about them. I knew I hadn't just invented, but I discovered the reality that abusing a child is always wrong and never a matter of opinion. I knew that that was true. I believed in purpose, that I wanted my life to be about something and to go somewhere. I understood things like hope and joy. I didn't just know the meanings of these words, but I appreciated and apprehended the sensations that came along with them. You see, you and I might hope for different things and find joy in different things, but hope and joy feel the same for you as they do for me. This is how we can tell that they're part of our little story. Another way you can tell that these things are part of your little story is because a lot of these qualities are noticeable by their absence as much as by their presence. You know you believe in unconditional love when you feel rejected. You know you believe in purpose when you feel as though your life isn't going anywhere. You know you believe in freedom when you feel trapped. Being trapped is just the absence of being free. So these things are noticeable by their absence as much as by their presence. And there's other things as well. I knew that death felt unnatural. I knew that when I listened to beautiful music, it was transcendental. It took me out of myself towards something bigger. I knew that every time I carried absolutely anything up a short flight of stairs, I would say, well, I don't need to go to the gym today. So I knew these things. I had a little story, the non-negotiables about my life. And what I wanted to do was to find a big story that made the most sense of my little story. Our word symbol, the word we use for symbol, as in a symbol of something, comes from an old Greek word, symbolon. And symbolon, in its original form, just means half of a broken object, which when matched with its other half, reveals the true identity of the thing. So our word for symbol really means half of something that's looking for its other half. And when it finds it, its true identity will be revealed. There was a Greek writer called Aristophanes who said that love is a quest for the restoration of what was lost. Love is a quest for the restoration of what was lost. So it's all that same image. It's that there's something in us, this little story, that it's searching for its other half, searching for that big story that makes the most sense of our little story. So as a young man, I went searching for meaning. If you like, I went searching for those symbols out there that matched the symbols I had in here. And I came to the conclusion that there's actually only one big story that comes anywhere close to making sense of our little story. And it's what J.R.R. Tolkien calls the true myth of Christianity. I went searching for treasure and I stopped at a small hill in first century Palestine where X marked the spot. And so for the last 15 years or so, I've been trying to persuade as many people as possible that that is in fact the true story that the universe is telling, that is in fact the origin story wired in to the cosmos. The problem is that I haven't really been very good at it, and I want to be honest and vulnerable enough to concede that. For instance, if you and I went out for coffee, and this one's on me by the way, get what you want, and we were chatting about these things, at some point, if I was a Christian and you weren't, you might say, okay Andy, show me why you're right and I'm wrong. And at this point, I think it's really important to say that I don't think I'm right and you're wrong. I mean, I am surely right and wrong about lots of different things. For example, it's my personal belief that Arsenal Football Club are by far the greatest team the world has ever seen. That is, unfortunately, a demonstrably false view. But nevertheless, I still cling to it. However, I am right that nobody really likes soup. I'm definitely right about this. People only pretend to like soup because it's gross. It's essentially vegetable blood, and people will say, oh, you can have meat soup now. I don't want to. I've never once felt the need to drink a chicken. Nobody likes soup. It's gross and disgusting. So I am right and wrong about lots of different things. But when it comes to Christianity, the truth or falseness of Christianity is independent of how I perceive it. The truth of Christianity doesn't stand or fall on whether I believe in it or not, whether you believe in it or not. So when someone says, show me that you're right and I'm wrong, I actually don't think that I'm right and you're wrong. I think that you are right, because the stuff that we've just talked about, the understanding, the knowledge of love and freedom and purpose and joy and hope and beauty and justice, well, you are right about these things. We both agree on these things. And so the question is, which story makes the most sense of that? You are right. Your little story is right. What might need correcting is your big story, your worldview, because your worldview might not allow for some of the stuff that you know to be true. Your big story might not match the stuff that you know is true in your little story. Anyway, in the past, if you'd said, show me, okay, so you're not saying that you're right and I'm wrong, but show me then why Christianity is true. In the past, I would have done things like talk about miracles and healings. And, you know, I am a charismatic Christian. I believe that the gifts of the Holy Spirit are for today. I pray for people to be healed, and I have seen some people healed. I don't have time here to talk about why most people I pray for don't get healed, but I have seen some healings. I'll give you an example. I was in Chesterfield last summer on a campsite, and a lady who was walking across the campsite twisted her knee and fell down. She was in agony. She couldn't get up. She couldn't even bend the knee. It was very painful. She told me it had happened twice before, and on both occasions she'd had to go to hospital with gas and air. So a friend of mine and myself, we put our hands on her knee as they do in the New Testament, and I just said a very basic prayer, Healing Prayer 101, in the name of Jesus, knee be healed, all pain go now, in Jesus' name, amen. And I experienced nothing, but this lady said that she felt an energy like a fluid enter her body through her head. It passed through her body, passed through the knee. It took all the pain away, restored the mobility. She got up on her own and she was walking around totally fine. I've spoken to her so many times since, and not only is she still healed, but she is on fire for Jesus because she experienced the power of God. So I believe in miracles. I also believe that God speaks to us not just through the Bible, primarily through his word, but that actually, because he loves us, he wants to communicate to us in different ways. And sometimes that is his voice in our minds. I'll give you another example. I was on a train and a young lad sat down next to me. He was in his early 20s, a young white lad, and I really wanted to share the gospel with him. And so I just said a little prayer and said, Lord, bring something to mind that I can use as an in. And what I heard in my heart, if you like, or the thought that dropped into my head, which is another way of saying I heard God say, the thought that dropped into my mind that corresponded with the feeling in my heart was, this guy's called Martin, just tell him that Jesus loves him. And I started laughing audibly because I thought, well, he's not called Martin, is he? He's 21 years old. There are no 21-year-olds called Martin. It's just my mind. I've probably been watching too many clips of Martin Clunes on YouTube, and why not? He's a very underrated actor. But I didn't say anything. Later on in this journey, this guy gets his bank card out and his first name is called Martin. And at this point, you can't do anything. And I didn't do anything. You can't say, oh, are you called Martin? How did you know that, Darren Brown? You're obviously magic. So it's not a good story of success. What I'm saying is that I do believe in the supernatural, the miraculous, the gifts of the Spirit. However, I don't use those to convince people of the truth of Christianity, because if I said this to you over our chai latte, you would say, okay, Andy, well, I don't think you're a liar, but I'm not going to change my entire worldview because you've seen somebody healed or the word Martin has come to mind. That's not enough for me to change my entire worldview, and that would be fair enough. And at this point, I might say, right, well, let's look at the Bible together. Now, obviously, the Bible can be misquoted and taken out of context. For instance, when the Apostle Paul writes to Timothy in one of his letters, God has not given us a spirit of fear. I imagine he wasn't quite thinking about me saying that on loop every time I'm in a park and a goose starts walking towards me. I suspect he had more profound reasons for writing that. However, I could say to you, right, well, let's look at the Bible, because I think I can show you that the Bible hasn't been doctored, hasn't been corrupted, that we have, at the very least, a faithful translation of what was written down 2,000 years ago. And again, I might be quite successful at that because I've actually read books and not just Twitter. But you might respond to me by saying, okay, Andy, fine, you've answered some of my questions, but the most you've done is shown me and demonstrated to me that 2,000 years ago, a small group of people in the Middle East believed that Jesus was God and were ridiculously good at telling people about that. It doesn't mean that Jesus is and was God. And again, that would be a fair response. You see, the problem with both of these approaches, talking about healings and miracles and the Bible, although they can be effective, what they do at times is to insert an unnecessary middleman. I'm trying to use something that you don't think you've experienced or you don't know about to show you that something else you don't think you've experienced or you don't know about is the true story. I'm using the wrong symbols. I'm using the wrong symbols to match the symbols that you've got in your little story. So how about this? Instead of me using wacky stories or randomly quoting scripture at you, why don't we just keep it more simple? Why don't we just look at your little story? Let's look at the things that you already know are true and simply ask, is there a worldview out there? Is there a big story that makes sense of that? And if so, which big story makes the most sense of your little story? It's only a very humble claim. Which big story makes the most sense of your little story? And I think you've worked out by now that your little story is the same as mine. You believe in unconditional love. You don't want to be rejected because of who you are or what you've done. You believe in freedom. You want to be free and not trapped. You believe in purpose. You want your life to be about something and to go somewhere. You do actually believe that some things are objectively wrong and objectively good. You see, one of the great myths in our society is the phrase, the meaning of life is to give life meaning, which sounds fantastic and takes about 10 seconds to show what utter nonsense it is. Because if the meaning of life is to give life meaning, if life has no objective, fundamental, foundational meaning, and we just get to invent it for ourselves, then to use the obvious example, when Hitler exterminated 6 million Jews, he didn't do anything wrong. He was actually doing what he should have done on an atheistic worldview, which is to give his life meaning. I mean, think about it. A little man from Austria captivated the hearts of an entire nation. He took on some of the greatest powers in the world and nearly won. He nailed it. And you know who I mean. You know who I mean by Hitler. You don't think I mean Craig Hitler, who works at the local golf club and really needs to change his surname. Come on, Craig. Hitler nailed it. If the meaning of life is simply to give life meaning. But the problem is that you think that that's obscene. You think it's obscene. You know that when people are exterminated, that's not creating meaning, it's trampling meaning, because it's trampling life. And you know that human life is valuable, which should show you that you don't really believe that the meaning of life is simply to give life meaning. You and I agree that life has meaning, but we don't invent it, we discover it. It's already there. We trip over it, we come across it, we run into it, but it's already there. And so the simple question is, which big story makes the most sense of the stuff that you already know? For those of us interested in science, the scientific method is simply finding a model that best fits the data. That's what science is. Science is not about objective proof in the way that mathematics is. Science is about finding a model that best fits the data. So I'm simply asking us to do this. What's the best model for what's in here? What's the best worldview for what we already know to be true? What's the line of best fit through love and hope and joy and purpose and freedom? How do we upholster our moral fabric onto the ultimate furniture of the universe? What are the options? Well, is it atheism? Atheism might be true. Any of these stories might be true. But atheism, the belief that there is no God, atheism makes the least sense of what you know to be true. Atheism, of all the big stories, makes the least sense of your little story. Because if atheism is true, then there is no right, there is no wrong, there is no justice, there is no judgment, there's just survival. Survive as well as you can, for as long as you can, however you can, because there's no justice, there's no judgment. Hitler didn't do anything wrong. Hitler actually realized more than you or I that we are simply protoplasmic sacks of chemicals with a limited shelf life. Hitler nailed it. So if atheism is true, there is no right, there is no wrong, there's just survival. If atheism is true, then you do have a purpose. Your purpose is simply to pass on your genes to the next generation. To quote Kool and the Gang, celebrate good times, come on. If atheism is true, then okay, I'll give it to you. You are free. You're free to be a randomly ordered collection of molecules dancing off against other randomly ordered collections of molecules until you reach your great reward, which is, on atheism, extinction. This is the good news of atheism, which is that whether you die at 92 years of age after a joy-filled life of humanitarian aid work, or you die screaming in pain after 9 minutes, your reward is exactly the same. Obliteration, annihilation, extinction. Why? I'll tell you why. Because the universe doesn't love you. The universe doesn't love you. The universe isn't sure why it created itself, let alone why you're here. If atheism is true, if there is no God, then we are all gate crashers at a party who weren't invited and didn't even bring tiramisu. The universe isn't sure why you're here, doesn't care that you're here, and won't be bothered that you're gone. I'm sorry, but the universe is just not that into you. And earlier when I said that that death feels unnatural, well, if atheism is true, you shouldn't. Because if there is no God, not only is death a natural part of life, but death is actually the great hero of the story. You see, you and I believe that love should win. It's part of our little story, and we see it on social media all the time. Hashtag love wins. We believe that love should win and does win, but I'm really sorry. If there is no God, if atheism is true, hashtag death wins every single time. Every single time. Death is the cowboy riding off into the sunset. Death is the bridegroom waiting for us patiently at the end of the aisle. Death always wins, always. And you can call yourself Stardust if you want, but the reality on a godless universe is that we are nothing more than the lingering odor from one big cosmic burp. Death wins. Love is not the greatest power in the universe. And at this point, not only do you not want to believe it, but you don't believe it. At this point, something in you should be resisting this. At this point, your internal rebel alliance should be scrambling its X-wings. Because something in you says, no, there's a better story, and I agree with you that there's a better story. But we're still not at Christianity, because after all, there's lots of other religions out there, isn't there? I was doing a comedy show last year. This is back on old earth before the pandemic swept away all of my live comedy work. And I was doing this talk, but in the form of my national comedy tour. And I was down in Bath, and I went to the pub after a really nice show. And this guy came up to me, although it was down in the southwest. He was a Londoner. In fact, he was a man so cockney, I expected him to say park life after every single sentence. He came up to me, he said, "Mate, I really enjoyed your show. You're a very funny guy, but I didn't like the bit where you talked about Jesus being the only way to God. That sounds very exclusive." And I said, "Yes, I agree that it's exclusive." He said, "Well, let me tell you what I believe. I'm a Buddhist and I believe that there are many ways to God." I said, "That's great. I mean, I hope in some way that's true. That would make things a lot easier for everybody." I said, "So tell me about this God." His name was Charlie. I said, "Tell me about this God." He said, "Oh, no, he is the things that you talked about. You know, that little story. He is unconditional love, and he's perfect peace, and he's joy and hope and freedom and justice." And I said, "Charlie, that sounds fantastic. I agree that God is all of those things. There is one problem though, which is that you haven't just described the God of Buddhism. You've just described Jesus Christ and literally nobody else. And this is not Christian bias. You see, Buddhism is an atheistic religion. There is no God in Buddhism. Buddha was a man who lived and died and hasn't yet been resurrected, but he was an agnostic. He wasn't sure whether God existed or not. In all of these Eastern religions, the really cool ones that everyone's into, there isn't a personal God to love you. God isn't personal. So you cannot say Buddhism has a God of love or every religion has a God of love, because on Buddhism there isn't actually a God to love you. The reality is that there's only one religion out there where there is a God who loves you unconditionally. There's one story out there where God loves you unconditionally. In their own words and on their own terms, in the Quran it says Allah loves not the unbelievers. God doesn't love the unbelievers. If all roads lead to God, but that God turns out to be the God of Islam, then most people watching this are in a lot of trouble. You see, these guys, what we're not saying is that Christians are better than other people, because I know loads of them, I am one of them, and we are not better people. What we are saying is that there's only one story of hope out there. Even if Christianity is false, it's still the only story of hope. I don't believe that it is false. But you see, all these other guys, these great figures from different religions, they don't preach about freedom in the way that you want freedom to exist. They don't preach about freedom because they didn't have security in their identity. And they didn't have security because they weren't allowed to know God. They didn't know God. Again, in the Quran, Muhammad says, "I do not know what will happen to me." Muhammad, the founder of Islam, wasn't sure that he'd lived a good enough life to get to heaven. Gandhi, one of the greatest men of all time and a Hindu, said, "It is an unbroken torture to me that I do not know my creator." It's an unbroken torture that I don't know God. Gandhi was expecting to go through hundreds of extra reincarnations, the only common denominator during which would have been his own personal suffering, until he reached his great reward, which on Hinduism is the snuffing out of the candle of desire. It might be a blissful extinction, but it's extinction. It's not something, it's nothing. These guys didn't preach about freedom in the way you want freedom to exist. Their big story didn't match your little story. But then Jesus comes along in John chapter 8 and he says, "You know what, guys, it might be better than that. You will know the truth and the truth will set you free." You think, well, what's the truth, Jesus? And no, it's not a what, it's a who. Jesus says, "It's me. I am the way, the truth, and the life. If you've seen me, you have seen the Father, and come to me, and because I live, you will live also." And then Charlie repeated and reiterated that he thought I was being overly exclusive. And I said, yes, I am speaking exclusively. I think that by not believing every religion to be exactly the same thing, Charlie thought I was somehow being bigoted or intolerant or something like that. But you know, the reality is that religions are not just superficially different and then fundamentally similar. Religions are, at best, superficially similar, but fundamentally different, diverse, and divergent. No religion preaches that the other religions are fully true. No religion does that. No religion teaches the same thing as any other religion. They all might be false, but they can't all be true. And Charlie said, come on, have some compassion. I said, that's interesting that you say the word compassion. So you think compassion is a real thing. It's a symbol of something, if you like. It's part of our little story. He said, yes, you know what compassion means, and you should have some of it. I said, Charlie, can I tell you? I don't mean to be arrogant, but compassion comes from two old Latin words bolted together. Compassion means to suffer with. Compassion means to suffer with. You know about compassion, but it means to suffer with. And do you know how many gods offer to suffer with and for you? One. Do you know how many gods tell you that they love you unconditionally, no matter what you have done? One. Do you know how many gods tell you that you actually can be forgiven, so that the stuff you've done wrong and the stuff that's been done wrong to you doesn't get to define your future? One. Do you know how many gods tell you that you actually can really be free and know peace and know joy and know that personal relationship with God? One. Do you know how many gods tell you that you should think that death feels unnatural because it wasn't meant to be that way and it won't be that way in the end? One. And it's all the same God. His name is Jesus Christ. I said, Charlie, Christianity is exclusive. It's exclusive because it excludes all the other religions where there isn't a God willing to suffer with and for you, where your cries of pain are either unheard or unheeded. Christianity is massively exclusive because it excludes every worldview, every religion where there isn't a God who says that you're worth dying for. There's one story where God says that you're worth dying for. And Christianity excludes all the stories where that doesn't happen. And frankly, I will take that kind of exclusivity, and so should you. You should happily rule out any story where the creator of the universe just isn't that into you. And you should pick the one where he knows you by name, calls you by name, and offers you what Jesus calls fullness of life. My favorite verse in the entire Bible is Colossians 2:15. I'm going to tell you what it says. That will be helpful, won't it? It says, having disarmed the powers and authorities, he, Jesus, made a public spectacle of them, triumphing over them by the cross. Having disarmed the powers and authorities, he made a public spectacle of them, triumphing over them by the cross. What do we mean by powers and authorities? We mean anything dark, any evil in your life that's trying to steal your joy and rob you of your identity. It might be addiction, it might be depression, it might be self-harm, it might be fits of rage, whatever it is. You see, these things are real. And you shouldn't be ashamed if you're struggling with these things, because we all struggle with different things. But at the cross, Jesus takes on these powers. He disarms them and he triumphs over them by the cross. You see, part of your little story is not that death feels unnatural simply, but that it's your enemy. You know that death is your enemy and that it's coming for you. It's going to win if something else doesn't happen. But you also know that death has minions. Addiction works for death because if addiction goes unchecked, it will kill you. Anxiety works for death because if anxiety goes unchecked, it will separate you from people in your life, from your life itself, and ultimately it will destroy you from the inside. These things are real. But you know what? Because of the cross, because of what Jesus has done on the cross, these things that are real, they no longer get to win. They no longer get to have the final say. They no longer get to define where you've come from, why you're here, and where you're going. Jesus does. You see, Jesus is not a symbol of hope. Hope is a symbol of Jesus. All roads do not lead to God, and you wouldn't want them to. You wouldn't want them to. You want a story where your value is infinite, where God's love for you is infinite. And it's that small hill in first century Palestine that you need to go treasure hunting to. The cross is the thing that killed Jesus, but it's a stop sign for everything trying to kill you. The cross is a cosmic restraining order against the powers of death and destruction arrayed against you. And I'm hoping as you think about that, you'll want to know more. You might say, well, it sounds great, but I haven't experienced this, Jesus. I want to let you know that if you felt the love of a parent towards a child or a child towards a parent, if you've desired that freedom, if you've known hope and joy, you have experienced him, because that's what it means to be made in his image. And he's the only one who makes sense of these things. The fullness of God dwells within Jesus. I want you to just think about it. And I hope that as you reflect on it, you'll think, okay, maybe this Jesus, maybe he hasn't been absent from my life. Maybe he's been there the whole time, just hidden in plain sight. And maybe I just wasn't looking at it from the right angle. Maybe I just needed to change my perspective a little bit and see him from a different angle.
Thank you so much to Andy for that. So much thought-provoking content in there about how our little story relates to God's big story, the story of hope and of a God who loves us and sent his son to save us. If you want to find out anything more about the Christian faith off the back of what Andy's said, do follow the links below here. Get in touch with the church via the website or via the Facebook page. We'd love to hear from you. And as you know, it'll soon be Christmas. We'd encourage you, get along to a local church, explore the story of the good news of the birth of Jesus and what that means for us. So thanks so much for joining us this evening. Take care and speak to you soon, maybe.